Welcome back to the Chara Project. I'm Sarah.
I'm Heather.
Our goal at the Chara Project is to help you build confidence in studying the Bible on your own and with a neighbor. And to that end, we encourage you to know the overarching story of the Bible. We want to give you a framework to help place yourself as you're reading the Bible to know where you're at. And so we do this by giving you some context and some history surrounding each section, each passage in the Bible. It's why we actually came out with the Story of the Bible guide. You can download this guide on our website. And within this, you'll find that we divide the story of the Bible into 8 sections or 8 eras. We've got creation, patriarchs, Exodus, kingdoms, exile. Then we move into the New Testament. We have Savior, the early church, and we end with letters. And so what we're going to do here today is we're going to dive into one of these sections. We're going to talk about the patriarchs, and we're going to help you find some themes that you can see within here, within each one of these sections, but within this one as well, and also how this section, even within this, we can see this points to Jesus. So today we're diving into patriarchs.
Yeah, so when we talk about patriarchs, what we're actually saying is we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Maybe those sound familiar to you. They come from the book of Genesis in chapters 12 through 50. And so the second section of the Bible is only still anchored in just one book. This is just a great reminder, if I could just pause already at the beginning of this episode to talk about that the first section that you covered, Sarah, that we were talking about with the creation, covers only about 11 chapters of Genesis. And that spans about 2,000 years. It's quite a lengthy amount of time that it covers. And yet the remaining 39 that we're going to talk about today are actually only 200 years worth of time period. But they zoom in on one specific family. And so it's worth us just noting that we're anchored in a lot of chapters, little amount of time.
That's right. And the fact that Scripture devotes so much space to this one family, it's a clue that this family is important. And in fact, it's going to be this family that we're going to follow throughout the rest of the Old Testament.
And I don't know if people realize that. I think oftentimes you're like, oh yeah, there's 66 books in the Bible and they're all just different little cute stories about different people. This is all one family we're following the entire way through. And obviously that's another reason why there may be genealogies kind of sprinkled throughout the Bible, is to show how they're all connected. I know everybody loves reading all of those. But there's a reason why they put them in there, is to show how this family is connected over time. And so after the line of genealogies that we see in Genesis 11, we actually are quickly introduced to a man named Abram. We're later going to know him as Abraham. And he's a person that God's picking out of humanity to father this nation or father this people group. They're often called the Hebrews throughout the Old Testament. They're going to represent God to the entire world, and they're going to be the plan that God uses to redeem humanity. We talked about that in the creation episode, that there's this idea that God had this plan of how he was going to redeem humanity. It's going to be through this family's line. In fact, God makes a covenant with Abraham, and we see it right in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. This is what he says to Abraham. He goes, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I show you. I'm going to make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people of the earth will be blessed through you."
That's right. And this actually, you mentioned the word covenant. This isn't the first time that we see this, we come across this word. If you were following along in the creation account, God made a covenant with Noah after he flooded the earth, saying that he would never flood the earth again. And so you actually see these covenants come up throughout the Bible, and we'll call them out each time. But I wanted to give a shout out to there's a covenant article on our website where you can go and learn a little bit more.
Yeah, we'll cover all the different different covenants in that article, because here's what makes a covenant unique. So let me just define what a covenant is, because I think oftentimes we need definitions to understand what we're talking about here. A covenant is a chosen relationship or partnership between two parties. They're making a binding promise to each other and work together to reach some kind of common goal. That's typically what the covenant is. Now, for Noah's case, God just said, well, I'm not going to flood the earth. And Noah's like, yeah. So there wasn't much that he had to do besides thumbs up, God. I love that idea. Let's never flood the earth again. Abraham was a little bit different. So on God's side, he promises Abraham 3 things. We see that in Genesis 12. He says, I'm going to promise you land. I'm going to give you some place to hang out. I'm going to make you and your descendants a great nation. You're going to be a big amount of people, which is that people group we follow throughout the Old Testament. And where all the people are going to be blessed through your family. Okay? So land, great nation or big family, and everybody's going to be blessed through your family. And all Abraham had to do in response to that was trust that God was going to do what he said he was going to do.
Yeah, we'll actually find that that covenant is repeated. God repeats that several times to Abraham, but that first time, as you mentioned, is in Genesis 12. And as God spoke, after God spoke, Abraham listened, which is pretty incredible. He left his family, most of his family, and he went off to an unknown land that God would later reveal would be Canaan, would be this promised land. But it's so incredible that Abraham listens and obeys and takes off. And sometime later on his journey, there were wars in the land, and the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. And the Lord tells Abraham, "Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great." And what's interesting, I think, is Abraham's response to this. He is not great at the moment. He kind of focuses on himself, and he complains that he's childless. And he says, "But God, what can you give me? What kind of reward can you give me? I don't have a son. A slave in my household will be my heir." And God is so patient and so kind here. And in Genesis 15, he restates that covenant that you were talking about, Heather, promising that Abraham would have a son that came from his own body. It wouldn't be the slave in his household. And he says, "Your offspring will be as numerous as the stars in the sky." And what's really, really cool here is in Genesis 15, Abraham believes the Lord and his faith is credited to him as righteousness. That's a theme we actually see picked back up in the New Testament. His faith was credited to him as righteousness.
Well, I love it because right around that time, Abraham's just like, how am I going to know? How's this going to live out? And God gives him some specific details of what it's going to look like. And he expounds on it to say that as part of this, you're not only going to inherit the land, but your descendants are going to spend 400 years enslaved and oppressed in a land that's not their own. And so he gives them like this good news. Hey, they're going to be blessed, but they're also going to go through some hard stuff. And you need to be prepared for that. And so I think it was good for God to kind of give him a preview of it's not going to be an easy road, but if your faith truly is, if you're faithful and you trust me, I'm going to get you through this and your family, which I think is beautiful and merciful of God to do.
Right. Right. So God promised Abraham all these descendants, all this offspring. And at the moment, Abraham's wife, Sarah, she's barren. They have no children. She's never been able to have children.
You're going to have a big family, but how?
Right. And they're getting older. And so about 10 years after God had first made this promise, she's still barren. And so Sarah takes matters into her own hands, and she gives her Egyptian slave to her husband and to try to see if she can have a child through her.
This is a theme we see, Sarah, throughout the Bible. We noted it in the creation section as well. There's this idea that humanity loves to put themselves first and try to kind of take control over their destiny rather than allowing and trusting God in that moment. And this is a moment where we see Sarah do just that. Rather than trusting that God is going to give her what she was told she was going to have, she goes and says, "No, I'm gonna do this on my own way."
Right. But I got to reflect and imagine, would I do anything different? She's been for 10 years. I mean, she was 75. She's probably about 85 years old now. And she's been promised to have a child and she hasn't.
Yeah.
And I know people who've gone through infertility and haven't been able to have kids. And I can't even imagine how much that must be weighing on her.
That's true.
Anyway, her servant, her slave Hagar, becomes pregnant. As you can imagine, there is some conflict now between Sarah and Hagar. And Hagar runs away. And what I think is so beautiful in this story is that an angel of the Lord meets Hagar in the wilderness and tells her that the Lord has heard her cry of affliction and that he will multiply her offspring through her son, who would become Ishmael, would be his name. And Hagar named the Lord here El Roi, which means the God who sees me. Hagar is the only person in the Bible who names the Lord.
I love that.
I think it's so beautiful, the mercy that God has here in this situation. Even though we can screw up and we take things into our own hand, God can still work through our sin and has a plan, can still work with it.
Well, absolutely. It's not like it was Hagar's choice to go and put herself in this situation. And it's almost like God says, I understand that you're in this situation, but I'm still going to love you. And on top of it, this offspring of Hagar's and Abraham's is still an offspring of this promised family. And so there is a piece of it that I think God definitely comes out with you get to see this compassionate, gracious God, his lovingness come out very easily in the story of Hagar. I just think it's beautiful.
Absolutely. And then they're going to wait. So this original promise, they end up waiting a total of 25 years.
Wow.
Abraham and Sarah wait a total of 25 years before their son Isaac was miraculously born to Sarah at the age of 90 and Abraham at 100 years old.
Oh my goodness. Nowadays we're, like after 40 is typically when you stop having kids. I can't imagine being, 90 and 100 having a kid. But here's what's interesting. I don't know how many people know this, but the consequences of Sarah's decision to get Hagar involved had some major consequences on our world today. Isaac and his family, this is the baby that she has, becomes the nation of Israel. We're going to talk about that. But the Ishmael, Hagar's son, becomes the nation of Islam. And today they are still fighting the conflict that Sarah and Hagar started off with, that we see in Genesis, is conflict we still see today in our worlds as these nations are fighting. And so the consequences of the actions of Sarah putting herself first is stuff we still see in our society today, which is crazy to think about, that it started with these two brothers.
Yeah, it's been going on for a very, very long
time.
Very
very long time. Now, let's fast forward into Isaac's life. He's grown at this point, and there's almost this foreshadowing that we see within the New Testament, and we get to see Jesus kind of pop off the page here in the Old Testament in a way, because God asks Abraham to make a sacrifice of his one and only son. The son that God had at least promised to him. It's not his only son, but his one son that God had promised to him. And so Abraham obediently prepares this idea of carrying out the instruction. They go to head up a mountain, him and Isaac is carrying the wood up for the sacrifice, to make the sacrifice on this mountain. And in this last moment, right before Isaac is about ready to get sacrificed and Abraham's going to go through with it, God stops him. And seeing his faith that has been proven, God provides a ram in substitute for Isaac for the sacrifice instead. And this is a beautiful moment where we see God reaffirming his promise to bless Abraham and make his descendants countless and bring the blessing to all of his nations and his people. It's a beautiful moment, but there's definitely some faith we're seeing loud and clear coming out of Abraham. I don't know if I could have done this, going up to a mountain and being like, all right, son, let's go.
Well, no, I mean, this can be a troubling passage, I mean, to say the least. And I think that in Hebrews 11, it talks about this exact situation. And I think if we can go there and read that for just a moment, it kind of gives, I think, a little bit of clarity that helps here. Hebrews 11, 17 through 19, it says, "It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God would be able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead."
Oh, I love that. I love that we see this faith come to life so beautifully. What I love about this story is we're seeing a tie to Jesus. Not only are we seeing an amazing faith story in Abraham, but we're seeing an interesting kind of foreshadowing, because here we have Abraham, who is this son that's going to bless a nation, and yet from his line, God's also going to send a one and only son to redeem humanity through Jesus. In fact, if you look at Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, or almost sacrifice of Isaac, you see similarities with the sacrifice that Jesus made. Let me just point out a couple that I just think are fascinating. Number one is that he's a beloved only son. Isaac is called Abraham's only and deeply loved son, and yet we see Jesus is described as God's beloved only son as well.
It's interesting because that language is there as one and only son. And we already talked about that Isaac actually wasn't Abraham's one and only son. He also had the son Ishmael. But Isaac was a unique son of a promise. And so that language is also used in John 3:16, that God sent his one and only son, this son of a promise, So there really is a cool
Beautiful.
parallel there.
I love that. The other thing that we see is that Isaac's a willing sacrifice, right? I mean, it's not like Isaac was fighting his way up the mountain. He's carrying the wood of the to be sacrificed up on the mountain. I don't know at what point in the hike he decided to let Isaac know. Abraham let Isaac know this, but I can imagine that his the burden of carrying the wood up for your own sacrifice would be quite heavy. And we see the same thing in Jesus as he's carrying the cross up to Calvary.
Well, when Isaac asks, what are we sacrificing? Abraham says, the Lord will provide.
The Lord will provide. And so already we see Abraham's faith throughout that moment. I call it a hike, but it probably was schlepping quite a bit if you're bringing up wood as well. The third thing that we see in similarities with Jesus and Isaac and this story is that God is providing that substitute. Sarah, you're mentioning that, right? God provides a ram that dies in Isaac's place, and yet when we see the idea of Jesus on the cross, he is the sacrificial substitute for humanity. He's the thing that gets sacrificed so that we don't have to endure death. And so it's just this beautiful, moment where it's not like the Bible actually points this out and says, hey, look, this is Jesus' story. But I think we see some foreshadowing that's coming out pretty loud and clear that says, hey, we need to be prepared because we're going to see a theme like this come out in the New Testament pretty fast in the Gospels.
I'm glad you brought all those out because, like I said, this can be a troubling passage. I mean, you read this through at first glance, and I don't really know what to make of it. But those three things that you just pointed out, this foreshadowing to Jesus, is really incredible.
Yeah. I think this is going to happen a lot as you go to study the story of the Bible, is you're going to see these moments in the Old Testament that absolutely are going to shadow over to the New Testament. And they're just going to be hinting throughout the way. And this is why we try to pull out as many themes as possible so that you can see them all. We're not going to cover all the themes, but we'll cover as many as we can. Okay, so this covenant of this land and nations being blessed, God made to Abraham, he then also passes down to his descendants. So we get to see it in his son Isaac, Isaac to his son Jacob. Let me just quickly touch on Isaac's story. So he ends up marrying Rebecca, who is a family member, a distant family member, but he went out to search somebody that was within his own family to be able to marry, and he ended up marrying this beautiful woman named Rebecca.
And Isaac and Rebecca's story parallels Abraham's and Sarah's in many ways, including Rebecca was barren, just like Sarah was, and only got pregnant through divine intervention. So, I mean, you see just God powerfully at work here in both of their stories.
Yeah.
And so Isaac and Rebecca have two twin sons named Esau and Jacob.
Yeah, they do. And typically in a traditional family like that, the birthright is usually given to the firstborn, and the firstborn was Esau. Hairy is how he's described, red and hairy. So I'm glad I wasn't described like that when I was born. But
aren't you glad you're not named today? Names back then were always describing something. They were really, really important. But that at birth, whatever we looked like at birth, we weren't named after the rest of our life.
I would have been called E.T. today. That's how I feel about my birth pictures.
Oh, I need more.
And moving on. Anyway, so this birthright, he would go to the firstborn, so Esau would get the birthright. Jacob tricks his father and Esau, actually, into receiving his older brother's birthright and his father's blessing. And so naughty, like he ends up taking him away. And I just have to say that given that the family would have known of this promised blessing from Abraham. Okay. Everybody in the family knows that God had talked to Abraham and made this covenant with him. And the honor of the birthright of that family person, that family member of Esau, to be able to carry that on. It seems a bit odd that Esau so willingly gave up his birthright. He gave it over a bowl of stew.
He must have been really hungry.
He came up from a hunt. He has this bowl of stew that his brother has, and he's like, I'll give you my birthright for it. And I'm like, okay, you obviously, Esau, did not trust God. You obviously did not see the power and the promise that was coming from God, because you gave it up for a bowl of stew after a good hunt. That obviously there was a disconnect for Esau. But with birthright in hand, Jacob goes and leaves home to go find a wife. He falls in love with Rachel, who he ends up making an arrangement with his future father-in-law to work for 7 years in order to be able to marry Rachel. And so they get to the wedding ceremony, and unfortunately the father-in-law tricks him and gives the other sister to Jacob at first. So he ends up marrying Leah, and then looks back and says, but I want I want Rachel. So he works another 7 years and ends up getting married to, so he has 2 wives, 14 years of work. That man definitely wanted to marry Rachel. But how sad of a moment for him, because this is a very sad story.
It is. And it's interesting, too, because Isaac, who had tricked his father and his brother out of his birthright and blessing.
Oh, Jacob tricking his brother? Yeah.
Jacob, thank you. Jacob had tricked him, and now he's the one being tricked.
Totally.
Right? It's really interesting, this reversal here, but it is such a sad story. It's a sad story for both Rebecca and for Leah, these two sisters who then are having this competition over who can give them the most sons.
Yeah.
And it's just terribly sad when you read this story.
No, again, we're dealing with two women in a household that were really struggling in their competition with each other. And Leah definitely was a lot more fertile than Rachel was. And so I think Leah ended up having a gaggle of boys. But, you have Rachel who was only able to have two. And so there was this constant struggle that you could see their family was in turmoil.
And maybe we should give a shout out real quick here that you do see polygamy here in Genesis. And it's the Bible, when it comes to historical narrative, the Bible will tell you what happened, not necessarily what should have happened.
Yeah, descriptive versus prescriptive.
Right. And you have to sometimes look at the consequences. And we can see God's original design for marriage back in Genesis 2, where it was between one man and one woman, and the two flesh became one. But it doesn't always necessarily say that what he's doing here is wrong.
No.
However, you can also look at the consequences of this super sad story of these two sisters who then also bring in their servants, and they end up having 12 sons between the two women and their servants.
Yes.
But it just wanted to give a shout out here. The Bible is not supporting polygamy. It is just telling you what happened
and the consequences that come from it. And so fleeing the trouble, Jacob ends up wrestling with God. He had some moments in his life where he just struggled, but he did have a change of heart. And so at that moment when he's hanging out with God, God renames Jacob and calls him Israel. And so you see this name Israel, or this nation of Israel, it's often called. It comes from this line of Jacob, which is coming from the line of Isaac, which is coming from the line of Abraham. These are our patriarchs. We're starting to see loud and clear developing a nation.
Right. And so Jacob has these 12 sons between his two wives and their servants. And these 12 sons go on to be the 12 tribes of 12 nations, or 12 tribes of the nation of Israel.
Yeah, that's right. We follow those 12 tribes throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Again, we're going to hound this home, how often we're going to see these groups of people reoccur. And in fact, Sarah and I, as we were preparing today, we kept on running across names of people. We're like, we've heard that name before. We've heard that name. As you start to read the Old Testament, you'll run across the exact same name, because you'll see a family line continue. Okay, so out of all of Jacob's sons, Joseph was his favorite, probably because it was the firstborn to Rachel, his beloved, the one that he had the crush on the most. And so it's no surprise that a father who has a favorite son would probably become the least favorite to all the brothers, especially if the dad's giving like a beautiful coat or robe for him to wear around, but also because Joseph would have these dreams about his brothers bowing down to him, and then he would tell his brothers, just note to self, don't brag about God giving you dreams that allow you to have your siblings bowing down to you. Doesn't go over very well.
It did not.
It didn't. And so Joseph, obviously, because his brothers were so mad at him, ended up selling him into slavery. They send him to Egypt, and they report that he's dead to their father Jacob. So he's off in their minds. He's done with, and they can just move on with their lives. And yet here Joseph gets carted off into Egypt, and he ends up getting sold into a prominent leader's home, and he becomes majorly successful. He ends up actually leading large pieces of Egypt and becomes prominent. He also goes through imprisonment, so he doesn't have. It's not all good. He gets the good and the bad. He has the leadership, but he also has the prison floor that he seems to experience while he's in Egypt. He's really in a tough place.
He is. And even though he's away from his home and his family, he's been betrayed by his brothers, it continually says throughout his story that God was with Joseph, no matter where he was. And he gave him success and blessed him, whether he was in Potiphar's household or even when he was in prison. God continued to be with Joseph.
I can't imagine if I were Joseph and I got carted off to a new land, new people, new customs, new everything, and I didn't have my family nearby, and I was all of a sudden thrusted into a new experience. How lonely that would have been. How desolate I would have felt. How scared. And yet to know that God is with us. I think oftentimes when we're in our lowest lows, we can often think, see, God's not with me. See, I have everything bad is happening around me. And yet I love this part of the Bible story because Joseph wasn't in a good place, and yet God was with him. That is such a beautiful reminder to us that just because we're going through a dark time, that doesn't mean God's not there. It just means that we may not be seeking him out or seeing him. And Joseph was very near and like close to him in that time. He was, in fact, he was actually known for that. His God, Joseph's God, was showing him dreams, and it was helping him become a leader within the space of Egypt, all the way to the point where he ends up becoming a leader of the famine that they were experiencing. They were running out of food. And it was Joseph that came in and gave them a plan on how to help save food for the famine and be able to save the people of Egypt. And it was because God was on their side. They recognized that Joseph's God was bigger because Joseph didn't let go of who God was. I just find that so fascinating. But this is what's even more interesting about Joseph's story. He's prominent. He's saving Egypt from this famine. And guess who comes walking in the door but his brothers? Because they need what? Food for their families. So they all come over to Egypt to get food, and he has a choice. He can either see them, recognize them, and take them in and forgive them, or he can totally say, I don't know who you are. And I don't know about you, but then like this was one of those moments where I was like expecting the Bible to say, and he put himself first, just like the theme we see. But that's not what he does. We see in this beautiful moment that he, instead of letting them suffer, he chooses to forgive. And it's just a beautiful moment that I think could easily have been a really good revenge movie if you play it out. And he chose not to do that in this moment.
Yeah, Joseph really does stand out. His story is remarkable. It takes up the last, 15 chapters of Genesis, and it's worth reading for all the reasons you just stated. But one of my favorite verses at the very end in chapter 50, Joseph has been reunited with his brothers, as you just said, and they're worried about what his response might be. And then Joseph says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. To have that perspective, like you intended evil against me, but God had a different plan and he's using it for good. That's incredible.
Well, and this is just seeing the wisdom that Joseph had, but that he could see God's sovereignty, that he could see that God had a bigger plan in place. So that probably allowed him to be able to forgive his brothers and their betrayal, trusting God and knowing that he was going to be there throughout this whole plan. I just find that so wonderful. So Genesis wraps up. You're right. Joseph is at the end of Genesis. We wrap up Genesis with Joseph's family moving and living in Egypt. They reunite. There's a lot of hugging and rejoicing. I can't imagine Jacob's face when he sees his dead son is not dead, and probably with a different haircut and totally looking Egyptian and not Jewish.
Yeah, they didn't recognize him.
Like a Hebrew. So like totally different guy. But Joseph and his family end up spending the remainder of their days in Egypt, not in the land that God promised them. Remember, we had that back in Genesis 15. God said, hey, your descendants are going to spend 400 years enslaved and oppressed in a land that's not their own. Guess what? This is that moment where we see Joseph and his family are hanging out in Egypt, and they end up oppressed and enslaved in the land. I'm getting ahead of ourselves, though, because that's going to be in the next section as we talk about Exodus.
So we could wrap up here, but there is one final thing in Genesis that I think is so interesting.
Are you going to talk about Joseph's bones?
Yeah, I am. Okay. So remember how in Hebrews 11 it's the faith chapter. And we just mentioned earlier that Abraham is recorded in Hebrews 11 for offering up his son Isaac, and he's recorded for his remarkable faith. Joseph is also in Hebrews 11, and you want to know why? He's in Hebrews 11 because he gave instructions about his bones that we find at the end of Exodus. So at the very end of Exodus,
Or Genesis. Yeah.
Genesis. Thank you. I need an interpreter right now. So at the very end of Genesis, Joseph gives instructions to his brothers that said, hey, when God delivers us, he has so much confidence. When God delivers us, take my bones out of here and bring them with you to the promised land.
Yeah.
That is why Joseph is recorded for his faith in Hebrews 11. How cool is that?
It's cool because you look at this random mention of bones in Genesis and you're like, nah, that's kind of weird and I don't understand why he's mentioning it. And then that's the thing he's actually known for his faith for. It's because he knew that God was going to redeem. He knew that he was going to save. He remembered the promise that God gave Abraham. Your family's going to be enslaved for 400 years, but they weren't going to stay enslaved. Joseph knew that.
Right.
And he knew God was sovereign. He knew to trust God. He was with God throughout this entire journey. He knew what God could use for good. So beautiful.
And so with that final detail at the end of Genesis, we can wrap up the patriarch era. You know, we come to the end of our patriarch era, and what is coming next is the Exodus era. So that'll be our next podcast. And we just wanted to thank you for joining us. And hopefully this was helpful as we explored this time and what was going on in the patriarch era. You can download the whole story of the Bible in a printable guide on our website. So make sure you go check that out. We think it'll be really, really helpful. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and make sure you subscribe, and we will see you next time.